After his wife's funeral, Ethan Mallory was publicly humiliated by his in-laws. They handed him a stack of inheritance papers like a cruel joke. A crumbling, abandoned mansion, cracked and rotting. "Go live there if you think you deserve it," they laughed. But when Ethan stepped into that cold house, the wooden floor echoed hollow, and beneath 30 years of dust lay a secret worth $199 million, a secret no one in that family had ever dared to mention. The house had once been a curse, but perhaps it was also a map. What had they been trying to hide for 3 generations? Golden Pines Baptist Church held barely 30 wooden pews, its white paint peeling, the low ceiling pressed down, and a tin roof that the rain drummed on with a slow, coffin-lid rhythm. Late autumn in Ashford, Pennsylvania, bit colder than any year before. The rain slanted in thin sheets, silvering the gravel yard before the church. Ethan Mallory stood on the wooden steps under the awning, his old uniform pressed close to his body. His left hand rested lightly on the shoulder of his daughter Hannah, 12 years old, wearing her mother's worn black dress. His right hand clutched the small hand of Luke, 6 years old, holding tight to a muddy toy truck. The boy's face hung low, worn sneakers sunk into a puddle. Hannah did not cry, but her eyes were mirrors, silent, cold, bright, reflecting every dim yellow lamp spilling from the church behind them. The wooden door swung open. A group stepped out, umbrellas ready. Heels struck gravel with a hollow chill. Eleanor Price, Ethan's mother-in-law, was the first to stop. A grey wool coat, a charity badge pinned firm, silver hair swept back, dark brown lipstick framing her mouth like the edge of a verdict. Beside her, Arthur, her husband, tall, thin, hands buried in the pockets of a brown overcoat. Behind them, Vanessa, Ethan's sister-in-law, clutched an LV bag under her arm as though it were a file of papers, and Grant, her husband, cast a flat look over the 3 of them, as if they were bags of trash left in the yard. Eleanor didn't raise her voice, nor offer a greeting, just one glance at Ethan, head to toe. Then, "Maya didn't have to die like this. If only you had been here from the start." Ethan said nothing. Rain slid off the frayed cap brim onto his collar. Hannah lifted her gaze toward the mother they had buried, not even an hour before. Eleanor stepped closer, bent to the children's height, her voice soft as silk, sharp as a blade. "If it weren't for the Price family, you 3 would be sleeping under a bridge right now." Grant chuckled, a dry, clipped sound, like a lighter sparking in the wind, short, sharp, insolent. Hannah drew her hands in, but Ethan steadied her shoulder. He stepped forward half a pace, his body square between the children and Eleanor. His voice was level, like roll call in a parade ground. "You may despise me, but not in front of my children. No one has the right to humiliate their father while they wear mourning clothes." Arthur clicked his tongue, pulled an envelope from his inner coat, and thrust it against Ethan's chest. "Tomorrow, my law office. 10 a.m. Reading of the will. 1 minute late, you lose everything." Ethan looked at the paper no longer than 3 seconds. The drizzle softened, leaving only the sound of his pulse on wet wood. He gave a single nod. No bow, no thanks, no reproach. Vanessa stepped past, her eyes scanning his faded uniform, the rough stitch on the left shoulder seam. Perhaps the lawyer should prepare for emergency guardianship. Eleanor followed, her eyes cutting across Hannah, a 12-year-old and a 6-year-old, living without electricity, without gas, without financial footing. That isn't care. Grant's grin stayed, as if the scene was a painting he had memorized long ago. Ethan didn't answer. He pressed the children forward, guiding them down the steps. Hannah turned back once her eyes meeting Vanessa's, not hatred, not fear, only a cold glint heavier than the rain. At the car, Ethan opened the back door, lifting Luke into the seat. Hannah climbed in beside him, clutching a backpack stuffed with the few belongings salvaged from the hospital clearance. The old Ford coughed alive. Ethan gripped the wheel, bowed his head, eyes closed for less than 2 seconds. On the porch behind him, the Price family lingered. Arthur spoke low, but Ethan heard it through the glass. "He thinks the battlefield taught him fatherhood." Eleanor added, "or how to hold a home." The headlights cut on. Ethan adjusted the mirror, enough to blur their shapes into eyeless shadows. He inhaled, slow, slow as his last weapon check before a jungle mission. "You all right?" he asked, eyes fixed on the side mirror. "Yes," Hannah said, "but Mom is not." Ethan didn't turn. His reply was a whisper, like the promise he had made at Maya's grave. "I know, but she'll rest easier if we don't fall." Luke raised the toy truck. "How far can this one go, Dad?" Ethan rested his hand on the boys, spun the wheels gently. "As far as you want, son, as long as there's a road and someone steering." Hannah turned to the window, watching rain streak down in long lines. In the churchyard, umbrellas jostled. People filed out one by one. Only one umbrella stayed unopened, hung on the rotting fence, tilted like a question mark. Ethan pressed the clutch, eased off the brake. The car rolled from the lot, gliding over washed tire tracks. The sky ahead bruised grey, clouds stretched like funeral ribbons not yet cut. Wind slipped through the cracked glass, carrying damp earth, engine oil, and the faint scent of a road no one had cleared. On the dash, Arthur's envelope lay damp at the edge. Ethan glanced, then tucked it into his chest pocket, the same place he had once kept a letter from a fallen comrade in Fallujah. No one in the car spoke again. But each knew, come tomorrow, there'd be no room for mercy, no time waiting for permission to prove worth. Only 3 of them now, a house cast off, and a promise to hold with both hands. The rain thickened. The wipers creaked, steady as boots on a march. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. The church lights shrank in the rear mirror. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because if anyone sought to judge him now, he would let the house itself speak. And he would be there on time, 10 Monsieur, not a minute late. Never again late when the most important things in his life had been taken once, simply because he had arrived too slow. The room lay at the end of a dark wooden corridor, a yellow light flickering slowly on the low ceiling, shadows retreating into the corners as though they wanted nothing to do with what was about to be announced. Ethan stepped across the polished floor, his boots leaving faint echoes in the smell of old paper and dried ink. No one smiled when he entered, but the silence was not respect. It was anticipation, waiting to cut him down. Hannah and Luke sat beside him, silent like 2 shadows that did not yet know what to fear. Ethan set the backpack at his feet, kept his back straight. His right hand rested on his daughter's knee, an anchor, a reminder to himself that this was the reason he was here. Across from him, Eleanor sat with her back pressed to the chair, eyes fixed on nothing. Arthur leaned on a cane, legs crossed, head tilted as though he already knew every word about to be read. Vanessa folded her arms, left hand on her right wrist, an expensive watch flashing with each restrained pulse. Grant sat just behind, head tilted slightly toward the window, but his eyes watched every flicker of reaction. The lawyer's voice was not loud, not threatening, not forced, just steady, like he was reciting Morse code from some faraway call. Pages turned, dry and sharp, like fingernails on a coffin board. Ethan listened to every word, missing none. Maya's personal property was divided, a portion for her parents, a portion for her sister, a portion for the community fund she had once supported. The current house was left to the 2 children, under the legal guardianship of their father, Ethan. But at the final line, the air in the room shifted. Bridal Oak Manor, including all land, structures, any objects affixed or not affixed, recorded or unrecorded in county records, is transferred in full ownership and responsibility of maintenance to Mr. Ethan Mallory. No one laughed immediately. It took several seconds, until the lawyer set the folder down, before the silence cracked into mockery. Vanessa spoke first. "Really? That wreck of a house?" Grant let out a sharp nasal snort, short as the click of a toy gun's trigger pulled just to hear the sound. Arthur shook his head, muttering softly, needing no permission. More costly in taxes than raising an infant. Ethan said nothing. He glanced down at Luke, who had leaned into Hannah, clutching his silver toy truck, one wheel broken. The lawyer pulled open a drawer, brought out a long wooden box lined with worn velvet. From it, he lifted an old key, long shaft, round head, oxidation along its teeth. When he set it on the wooden table, the sound landed heavy, like a hammer striking sleeping iron. "This is the main key. There is no copy. If you lose it, the only way in is to break the lock by hand." Ethan picked it up, felt the chill of corroded metal stick against his palm. He said nothing, just slid it deep into his chest pocket, the way a soldier tucks away a last card before a tactical retreat. Vanessa opened her purse, pulled out a check, laid it on the table, smoothing it flat as though ironing out the wrinkles of an offer. 50,000. I'll buy that manor. For the children so they won't have to live among mold and rot. You have no means to support them, Ethan. Don't be selfish. Ethan looked at the check. No smile, no thanks, no anger. Just one phrase, clipped, like a drill order. Not for sale. The lawyer said nothing. He nodded, folded the check with care as though it were paper never to be used, and tucked it into the bottom drawer. No one rose quickly. The air hung heavy, binding Ethan, Hannah, and Luke into the small corner of a room no one wanted them to occupy. When the reading ended, they rose one by one. Eleanor did not look back. Arthur adjusted his collar. Vanessa tapped at her phone, head down but eyes flicking fast at the children. Grant left last, shoes rasping lightly on the floor. The lawyer stopped Ethan. Alone now, he pointed to a stack of technical files for Bridal Oak Manor surveys drawn up when Maya and Ethan first married, when the Price family had once considered restoring the house. There's a side note. Most never noticed. The engineer's survey mentions an oddity beneath the dining room floorboards, different, possibly an old trapdoor, purpose unclear. It notes, secondary lock, risk of collapse, possibly former wine cellar. Insole. The lawyer looked up, glasses sliding low on his nose. Be careful where you step, and don't let anyone else enter before you. Ethan nodded. No questions, no surprise. Because a sound had already stirred from deep memory the moment that key touched his hand. A hollow thunk, heard long ago on patrol over the floorboards of a weapons depot or the wooden stairs of a house in Kandahar, where people hid secrets beneath boots no one thought to question. He left the room, back into the hallway where Hannah stood straight, eyes lifted. She asked nothing. Luke slept, his cheek pressed against his sister's shoulder. Ethan lifted the boy in one arm, opened the door with the other, the key pressing against his chest in rhythm with every step. Outside, the rain had not stopped, but the wind had shifted, and in his mind, a map unwritten began to form. It might lead to something worse than mold and taxes. Or perhaps, to something Maya had left that words could never carry. But Ethan knew one thing with certainty. He would open it himself, with no help, no sale, no surrender. Not a single step off course. The old silver pickup stopped at a rusted fence, where the heavy iron gates sagged to one side, their hinges held only by a twist of loose wire someone had once patched in haste. A rotten wooden sign hung crooked, the words Bridal Oak Manor nearly vanished, just a few black strokes gasping through a skin of green moss. Wind slid out of the trees, across the lawn, lashing dust and the stench of rot through the half-closed glass. Ethan shut off the engine. The key still rested in his chest pocket, pressed against him since the lawyer's office, steady and cold as if it had become a grafted bone. He climbed out, opened the back door, lifted Luke still dozing, then motioned for Hannah to grab the backpack. The three of them stood at the gate, as if before an abandoned outpost, uncertain whether the enemy lingered inside or had long retreated, certain only of one thing: no one else would go in before them. Ethan pushed the gate. The hinge screamed. A long scrape like nails dragged across a frozen chalkboard. Hannah flinched, steadied herself, and stepped closer to her father. The steps to the porch were slick with moss, broken tiles cracked and raised, footprints fossilized from some past generation. Ivy smothered the railing, hanging down like a torn curtain over a history not yet buried. The front door, once white, had peeled at the bottom, its hinges jutting out like broken bones. Ethan braced his foot, drove his shoulder forward. The door groaned open, the sound like a throat dragged awake after years of sitting in sleep. No bell, no greeting. Only the stench of damp, of mice, and a coldness that didn't belong to weather but to something people no longer dared to name. He stepped in first, light from the doorway stretching long across the dust-coated boards. Each step left a print like nails driven into a blank page no one had dared write on. Hannah guided Luke behind, their steps tentative as though the floor might collapse beneath them. Ethan drew out a flashlight, swept left to right, each room in a fixed rhythm. Open door, sweep beam, listen, mark exits, check ceiling, note weak spots. Instinct was not in his head. It lived in the muscle memory of every move. Each doorway released a different odor: mold, leaks, old oil, damp wood, time itself. The living room was empty. Mold shadows stained the wall where couches had once stood, square dust patches, shaped like faces left unspeaking. A window sagged loose, curtain torn aside like a sick arm hanging useless. Ethan reset the frame, braced it with a wooden wedge. The kitchen tiles were cracked, sink rusted, faucet bone dry. He twisted it, pipes moaned, metal groaning after years forgotten before spilling a thick brown flow, which slowly cleared. He let it run, timed it, checked pressure, then shut it off. Hannah stood behind, one hand steady on her brother's shoulder, eyes sharp, watching, as though she were learning lessons her mother had never finished teaching. Ethan unrolled the field kit, spread a tarp in the driest corner of the living room, sleeping bags laid tight to the wall, away from leaks. Draft gaps between window frame and brick, stuffed with rags and grey tape. A small gas stove set on cracked tiles, flames struck, water boiling quick in silence. No one spoke, no one needed to explain. 3 plastic cups lined in a row, cocoa powder measured equal, hot water poured steady, steam rising like a thin smile on a sunless day. "Password?" Ethan asked, eyes on the children. Hannah did not hesitate. "Our home," Luke repeated, softer, as if learning something more important than an address or a surname. "Our home." Ethan nodded. No smile. No pat on the head. He marked it by taking his cup, drinking once, setting it down. The house was no longer just rotted timber. It became a trench, temporary. A place to sleep without being thrown out. A structure with walls, roof, water, entry point, and now, discipline. Scratching rose from the ceiling. Hannah looked up. No scream, no panic, only stillness. Ethan swept the beam upward. A brown stain ringed on the ceiling above the dining room. Boards darker there, one slat out of rhythm with the rest. Tiny cracks split across like dry veins. At the edge of the wall, Hannah pointed. There. Something carved. Ethan fixed the beam. Beneath the dust, a faint line, an arrow, 3 marks intersecting like half-finished nautical charts. Not deep, but not natural either. He memorized it, did not touch, then braced his foot against the old dining table, pressed on a discolored plank. The sound was unlike anything else in the house so far. A hollow thunk, low and tight, not echoing outward but down, as though someone was tapping lightly on a coffin lid with the back of their hand. Ethan crouched, tapped with his finger. The return was uneven. Space beneath. A cavity. Certain. Hannah's eyes searched his. Ethan gave one nod. Silent. He marked the edges with tape, stepped back, settled on the floor by the stove, drank again. The ceiling still creaked. Wind threaded through cracks, whistling like surf against a wrecked hull. The house spoke not in words, but in code. Every groan, every scratch, every drop, every hinge squeal, every drip on wood, spelling its rhythm. Ethan stripped off his gloves, set his hand flat to the floor, back against the wall. He heard Luke's breath steady in sleep, heard Hannah wiping the glass with the edge of her dress. No one said goodnight. No one asked for another blanket. No one mentioned their mother. But all 3 knew, starting tonight, no one else would hold this house for them. No one was coming to rescue. No one left to trust but each other. And that plank in the dining room with its hollow note was not a danger. It was an invitation. Dawn at Hollow Creek arrived more like a warning than a welcome. Light pierced the grey veil of mist strung across leafless branches, striking the dust-filmed windows of Bridal Oak Manor in pale streaks too weak to warm, too dim to steady. In this house, uninhabited for more than 20 years, every corner, every hinge, every crack carried its own voice, whispers of time held back, not released. Ethan rose earlier than the first bird on the tree line. He heated water, splashed his face in a chipped enamel basin on the old counter, then checked each door as if still on garrison duty. By the time the sun had barely lifted shadows up the walls, he was already standing in the dining room, eyes on the ceiling, where yesterday's faint carving had left its unanswered question. His hands, once used to rifles, now gripped a rope-tied pull ladder. His knee braced the base, balancing as he tapped at the panel above. With a hooked iron tool, he wedged the seam and pulled down. Wood scraped slowly, like the lid of an old coffin opening for the last time. The folded ladder dropped reluctantly, joints creaking through the scent of dust long settled. As he climbed, the debris fell like desert sand breaking apart. The smell of rot hit his face, not the odor of old timber, but of something forgotten yet lingering, like a shadow unnamed. The attic was cramped, beams crisscrossed like broken ribs. He fixed a lamp to his forehead, crouched, and stepped carefully across boards soft with age. Dust swirled thick in his beam like a backward rain, falling upward into the past. At the eastern rafters, he stopped. One plank was different, darker, too smooth compared to the rest. His finger touched, then withdrew. Carved lines lay hidden beneath the dust, like scars not yet reopened. He tore a sheet from his notebook, ground charcoal fine, rubbed it slow across the surface. The gesture was like coaxing memory awake. Faint strokes emerged, a triangle with serrated edges, a symbol of danger or military coordinates. Below it, a broken string of numbers, 4 digits, a double slash, 3 digits irregular, yet patterned. Ethan mouthed them, eyes fixed. Under the numbers, a small arrow pointed southwest. But what stole his breath for a beat was the set of letters carved over each other beside the symbol, hurried yet deliberate BOM. Ethan lowered himself, knee braced on the beam, palm flattening the paper rub, then pulled a worn camera from his pack, photographing every angle. He scanned the attic, no mark rivaled this one. It felt like someone had come here, leaving a sign for something most who lived in the house had never known or had known, but chosen to ignore. Footsteps whispered below, "Hannah." She didn't call, only stopped beneath the ladder, her voice soft enough for her father to hear, low enough not to wake the boy asleep downstairs. Ethan snapped another shot, then backed out. Descending, he held the fresh charcoal rub, lines still smudging. On the table he spread it flat. Hannah stood beside him, staring as if reading a secret. Ethan didn't speak. He pointed to the triangle. She stayed silent, then unclasped the chain at her neck, the only thing left from her mother, a thin necklace with a small round locket. Ethan took it gently. Yellow light cut through the window, falling long across the table. He turned it. On the front, Maya's etched smile, small, sad, barely scratched in by a pin. On the back, the detail that froze them both. A small symbol, another serrated triangle, carved faint beneath the worn silver plating. Not large, but undeniable. Not strange, but identical to the one smudged on Ethan's page, still smelling of soot. The room went still. Hannah looked at him, unblinking. Ethan clasped the locket back at her throat, fastened the catch, pressed her shoulder not to thank her for proof, but for keeping it safe. Outside, sunlight filtered through broken leaves, touching the rotted fence. But inside, wind shifted, slipping through door cracks like the sigh of someone trapped between rafters and floor. Ethan folded the charcoal sheet into quarters, slid it into his notebook. In his mind, 2 fragments aligned, the hollow plank in the dining room, the marks on the eastern beam. The rafters were the head, the floor, the base. A house without a middle, only above and below like 2 halves of a lock not yet fitted. And Maya somehow had left the key, not in words, but in symbols, not for anyone to understand. Only for the one still standing between roof and floor, holding to an old promise, leave no one behind. In that moment, the wind stilled, the house listened to its own memory, and the soldier, now a father, understood. From this second, there was no retreat, only descent, but not into an ordinary cellar, into the heart of the house itself, and into what Maya had once chosen to hide. Ethan stood in the old kitchen like a man about to dissect the memory of the house itself. Heavy gloves wrapped the fingers that once gripped rifles in the desert. A headlamp burned on his forehead, like a beacon from the underworld. He knelt on the dining room floor, where the plank had sounded hollow the day before, and wedged a steel bar carefully under each edge. Each plunge of metal drew a groan from the wood, not the sound of a dead thing, but the breath of the house, warning in whispers. Rusted nails cracked, dust drifted down like ash. A muted clunk, the plank lifted, revealing a circular iron hatch hidden deep beneath worn timber. His glove traced the rim, feeling rust scabbed thick, untouched for decades. He braced bricks, wedged for airflow, lashed a rope around his waist tied to the table leg, then slipped his hand through the pull ring. The metal's cold stung through the leather, stopping him for a breath. One exhale and he pulled. The hatch creaked open, hinges shrieking, and a draft of mold and old oil poured up like a soul dragged awake from long sleep. Below wound a spiral of stone steps, narrow and dropping into thick black. Ethan raised his lamp to full power, its beam streaking across wet stone walls clothed in moss. His first step struck like pressing into the house's guts. Each one after was a vow not to turn back. At the bottom lay a cramped chamber, barely 2 meters tall, dirt floor, stone walls cracked and seeping damp. In the corner, 3 iron chests stacked, wrapped in tarpaulin worn brittle, beside a skeletal wooden shelf. Ethan approached, hand on the cover, the stench of oil rising, dense as a soldier's memory. He stripped the tarp away. The chest showed, lock corroded but intact. From his pack he drew lock tools, fingers moving with the precision of a man who had cracked open ammo crates 100 times, a small click sharp, slicing the silence. The lid gave way. Inside lay heavy rectangular bars, raw gold, slick in a film of dark oil. Beside them, a rolled parchment tied in cord unfurled. It revealed 19th century railroad bonds, red seals, signatures inked by hand. Ethan skimmed, set them aside, not rushing. The next chest, an old ledger, bound in leather darkened by time. Pages filled with inked script, thin lines like moss. Symbols appeared, same as those carved in the rafters, a jagged triangle. The overlapped letters, Bomb Bridal Oak Manor. Names, dates, streams of money, short-coded notes. He didn't turn further. He shut the book, set it back with care, lifted his phone and photographed every chest, every page, every corner of stone, every mark. Not a bar removed, not a thing displaced. His hands shook not from greed, but from truth. A truth heavier than all the gold stacked here. This house had once been a hidden financial station buried in the earth. Few had known or dared to speak it. Climbing back, Ethan paused mid-stair. He tilted his head, lamp throwing light across rust veins spreading like roots. For a moment, Maya appeared in his mind, walking through a faded afternoon, palm pressed against a cracked beam as though patching it with her gentle gaze. The image dissolved when his boots found the familiar floor again. He sealed the hatch, reset the planks as if untouched, noting every detail in his pocket notebook. That night, while Hannah folded sleeping bags and Luke adjusted the torn curtain, Ethan sat at the table, checking window ties, eyes flicking through the dust-blurred glass. Suddenly, headlights flared just outside the gate, where a silver sedan stood idle. Only a moment, then dark again. No engine, Reverend, no retreat. Just stillness, like the night itself had begun to breathe. Ethan said nothing. He rose, bolted the latch, drew the inner steel shutter closed. In the silence he felt one certainty. Someone knew too much, and was waiting. In the dark, the tick of the clock joined the breathing of 3 souls bound inside an old house. For Ethan, Bridal Oak Manor was no longer a pile of rotting wood. It was a trench, a map, a memory. The last exam, a place where a soldier could not misstep. Not because he feared death, but because survival now meant keeping something decent alive for his children. And in that half-sleep of the night, a faint tap like fingernails on metal rose from beneath the dining room. No one stirred. But in the soldier's mind, Ethan knew. What lay under the house was no longer resting. That morning, the forest air was thick with damp earth and resin, the sunlight warming only part of Bridal Oak Manor's peeling porch. On the muddy yard, the tires of a black SUV sank lightly, leaving crooked tracks as if the ground itself hesitated before what was about to be uncovered. Ethan was already waiting, arms folded, uniform neat as always, his eyes discreetly measuring as 3 women in identical gear stepped out. Nitrile gloves, sealed containers, inert gas crates. One of them, her dark hair tied tight, safety goggles hooked behind her ears, shook his hand and gave her name Clara, a federal asset appraiser. Ethan offered only a nod, his chest steady as tempered steel. The first task was to map the cellar and document its physical state. Ethan led them down the old wooden hall, through the dust-choked kitchen, to the dining room where he had marked the hollow plank days before. The team paused, masks on, lamps lit. Clara lifted each plank, flipped them, checked for tampering. Ethan had already braced 2 broken chairs beneath the hatch to catch its weight. When the iron ring was pulled again, the screech of metal sliced the air like a cold blade. Clara descended first. She tested humidity, scanned gases, logged base readings before signaling the others to lower the kits. Each chest was shifted just inches, enough to inspect, record, identify. Beneath the oil tarp lay bars of gold, uniform in size, wrapped in brown wax, stamped with pre-war seals. Clara nodded slowly, as she found a federal bank mark dated 1946. The shelf beside still bore chipped paint proof. The environment had gone undisturbed. One team member filmed every inch with a macro camera, the light strobing across tarnished metal like the eyes of wild animals deep in a forest. In the far corner stood 2 ancient wooden crates, hinges rusted. One opened to bundles of railroad bonds, Central Atlantic Line shares, most dating from 1899 through the early 20th century. The other held a ledger leather darkened with age, pages inked in fine slanting script, the brown fading like moss. Each line listed ingot codes, depositor names, and the repeated mark, BOMB, Bridal Oak Manor, identical to the rafters carving. Clara frowned in thought. then photographed each page with a dedicated lens, tagging them with QR codes, sealing every item with federal-grade insurance markers used only for classified custody. When the survey was finished, Clara climbed out, stripped off her gloves, wiped her brow. She looked at Ethan, voice steady but rasped, "We can't give an absolute value yet. But just the gold and bonds alone, at the low end of the current market, come to an estimated $199 million. $199 million. The figure echoed in Ethan's head, not like a victory cry, but like the far-off horn of a ship through fog. He said nothing, only tightened his watch strap, a reflex to steady himself, not to own, to guard. The next step was chain of custody and insurance. Clara called the national asset insurer directly, secured a special file code and federal sign-off. Every item in the cellar was packed, sealed, tagged with control codes, timestamps, and photographed a dozen times each. The full catalog was uploaded with restricted access, only counsel, insurer, and legal guardian permitted to see. At Clara's urging, Ethan brought Julia Park to complete the trust paperwork. They worked in the kitchen, the only room with chairs and a shaft of light through the broken shutters. Julia read through the inventory, nodded. "We'll structure an irrevocable trust," she said, tapping the table. "Beneficiaries, Hannah and Luke. Ethan as guardian. No one, not even you, can sell, gift, or alter any portion without independent oversight." Ethan agreed without hesitation. He signed, Julia signed, and 2 witnesses from the insurance side signed. Documents scanned, encrypted, uploaded. Clara checked her watch, issued her last instruction. "Say nothing to anyone except insurance and law enforcement. Not neighbors, not friends. Tonight, the assets will be transported to secure federal storage." The sun slid low beyond the pines. Crates clattered in the yard as the tech team loaded thermal containers. In a rare stillness, Ethan caught Hannah framed in the doorway, Luke in her arms, both staring at the yard as if a secret had just been carried away from them. No words. The silence itself lay like the tarp over the treasure, protective, uneasy. Only after the convoy pulled out, taillights swallowed by trees, did Ethan return inside. He reset the chairs, wiped the floor, stripped off his mask. Then Julia's phone left behind on the table lit up. Ethan glanced, caught the message. "Is it moving tonight?" No sender, no signature, 6 words. A blade sliding into his breath. Ethan didn't touch the phone. He stepped out onto the porch, eyes sweeping the property. No sound. But in the thickets at the end of the dirt road, something stirred. Not an ending, only the warning horn of the next fight. That morning, the county courtroom felt coated with a thin layer of ice over every breath. The ceiling rose high, walls paneled in dark wood, fluorescent lights flickering faintly above. A clock ticked on the wall, counting down as though towards something about to crack. Ethan sat upright, hands clasped tight on his knees. His light grey suit was pressed flat, but his breathing wavered, as though draft slipped through his chest. Beside him, the 2 children sat still, eyes fixed on the floor, not moving, trained to stay silent in the places where hammers and law ruled. Across the aisle, pressed suits creaked when they shifted, starched to the point of making sound. Expensive cologne mingled with the smell of ink bleeding from thick folders stacked on the table, thickening the room's air. A packet was slid toward the judge. Its contents read aloud, word by word, crystal clear. A petition to strip Ethan of guardianship on grounds of unemployment, residence in a structure unsafe for minors, lack of steady income, unfit management of high-value assets, and high risk of abuse of trust funds. The words came wrapped in statute but sharp as razors. Ethan did not flinch, did not turn. He stared ahead. The only sign of life within him was the clench of his hands. Then, from his side, a second file was opened. A counterplan, laid out in detail. Full insurance contracts with federal identifiers, engineering plans for reinforcing the entire structure, roof, load, bearing beams, doors, and flooring supervisory reports. Photographs of the property with alarms, infrared cameras, motion sensors, and safety layouts for each child's room. Alongside were vaccination records, medical checkups, and letters from doctors confirming the children's environment as stable. Each page turned was a heartbeat hammering faster. No shouting, no outbursts. Only evidence and law, cold and exact, falling onto the bench like notes in a song stripped of feeling. The judge, an older man with silver hair and sunken eyes, hands deliberate and never rushed, flipped through as though reading not documents but the biography of a man on trial not for crimes, but for lacking pedigree. After 2 hours of contest, he closed the file, looked at Ethan for a long moment. His voice rasped, each word striking like stone. "The petition is denied. If the concern truly is the children's welfare, you ought to aid the lawful guardian, not harass him. Do not cut the legs from under a father who has just buried his wife and is rebuilding a home from ruin." The gavel struck 3 times. The room exhaled, like a lung finally released. Ethan did not smile, did not bow. He simply laid his hand on his daughter's shoulder, a small pat. his eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors, seeing no one else inside. In the parking lot, the sun was high, but cold lingered in his chest. Near the old pickup, he stopped. The front right tire slashed deep by a blade. Tire oil streaked black across concrete. On the windshield, tucked under the wiper, a folded paper. He pulled it free. A blurred photo, edges smudged, but clear enough. The two children playing in the backyard. Hannah bent over her puzzle, Luke beside her. A thick red slash across both faces, drawn with marker like blood. No words, no open threat. But the framing told it all, shot through a lens, from a distance, over the fence, through brush, meaning one thing. I see them. I'm close enough. Ethan did not reach for his phone. He stood there long, wind cutting through his hair, his wrists, his unblinking eyes. Then, slow, he opened the truck bed, pulled the emergency kit. The spare tire replaced with the speed of a soldier who had worked under flares. He checked locks, cameras around the truck, the courthouse grounds. No one followed. No one helped slash his tire either. On the drive back, the children slept in the rear. Ethan kept the speed steady, silent. But his mind ran scenarios no ordinary father should ever have to picture. Someone knew where the children were. Someone had sent a message. And the message was not written in the language of law. Law was a battle, but what lay beyond, Ethan knew, was war. That night, as the wind shifted down from Hollow Creek Ridge toward the foot of Bridal Oak, no one in the house was awake. The pine forest behind hissed like old strings pulled too tight. A draft slid through a crack in the upstairs window, carrying the acrid scent into Hannah's room. She woke with a cough. The first sensation was not fear, it was instinct. A reflex etched in her after years of living with a father who had taught her to distinguish the must of old books from the sting of singed wiring. She pressed her hand to her nose, lifted her head, scanned the room. No fire inside, but the smell was there, thick, harsh, unfamiliar. Not wood. Smoke. Smoke, she whispered. Downstairs, Ethan was already moving before her voice reached him. He wore only flannel pants and a faded t-shirt, but boots were on, eyes sharpened. No questions. No hesitation, just one order cutting through the quiet. Call 911. The house came alive like a drill. Hannah ran to the landline by the door, hands trembling but precise. Under the stairs, Luke had already dragged out the emergency pack, a green canvas bag with heavy zippers, packed the day they moved in. 2 liters of water, spare batteries, flashlights, passports, birth certificates, fever tablets, and an old battery radio. Ethan knew without looking the children would meet at the rear assembly point beneath the tarp shelter he had marked, with reflective paint, next to the reserve water tank. It was all procedure. He charged the front door with nothing but a blanket he had soaked in the tub. Wind slapped his face, bringing the raw reek of fuel and heat. At the gate of Bridal Oak, a heap of straw soaked in gasoline blazed. Flames licked uneven, splattered as though poured by hand, strip by strip. Not meant to destroy, but to threaten. Ethan wrapped his arms in the wet blanket, beat at the flames. They shrank, but clung. A plastic bag within caught, popped, flaring another blaze near the fence post. He swung the hose, dousing hard. Smoke stung his face, burned his eyes, but he did not stop. Even while striking at the fire, his eyes swept the tree line, and he saw 2 figures. One tall, one slight, thin silhouettes breaking toward the willows. One carried something long, perhaps a fuel can. Distance and dark blurred details, but the image stamped itself into him, each stride heavy as iron. By the time sirens cried, Ethan had beaten the worst down. The gateposts were charred, planks blackened. A county patrol car arrived, then a forensic van, lights flashing red, white, blue. Hannah and Luke sat at the muster point, wrapped in blankets, eyes wide, unblinking. They did not cry. They did not call. They only watched, as though replaying a script rehearsed exact, like their father had taught. Police cordoned the site. Aluminum rods scraped ash samples into numbered bags. A tech lifted a damp rag, sniffed, nodded gasoline. Prints marked the soil, rubber soles, small size. A dented green plastic fuel cap lay nearby. Ethan's roof camera had caught footage, grainy, but enough. 2 intruders vaulting the fence, one holding a jug-shaped object. A silver sedan idled at the tree line, headlights flashing once, license plate digits visible. Police tagged it, clipped images, promised a registry check. By dawn, Julia had filed an emergency restraining order, not just for Ethan, but for the children and the estate. The motion carried police photos, burn marks, and the video. The file was thick, urgent, undeniable. This was no longer a custody dispute or property quarrel. It was a campaign, and this time, the weapon was fire. When the police withdrew, Ethan bolted the house, fitted new steel latches to every window. He replaced every battery in the infrared lights, tested each camera, synced footage to 3 hard drives. Hannah shadowed him, quiet, passing tools, jotting numbers into his notebook, asking only what mattered. No wasted words, no comfort needed. Luke didn't play either. He wrote out a checklist, if fire, in his crooked script, and taped it to the refrigerator. That night, as the others slept, Ethan descended to check the cellar hatch. The old stairs groaned under him. His headlamp lit the dust film. The iron door was closed, the lock secure. But at the frame's edge where steel met, cement a sheen. Oil. Smooth. Fresh. He touched it. Anti-rust compound. Not the kind he'd last used. Familiar but not his. Which meant someone else had opened it since appraisal day. He stood long, lamp sweeping floor to ceiling. Every nail, every crack, every peel of paint searched. No one there. But presence clung. Not a person but preparation. Someone had entered the game, and next time, it might not be fire. Ethan did not retreat, did not call, did not falter. He locked the hatch 3 times, bolt, padlock, chain. Then upstairs, he opened his thick notebook, turned to a blank page. The first line, ink pressed hard, next time, they don't get to walk away. That night, though wind howled around the eaves and the moon drowned in cloud, Bridal Oak was no longer a passive house. It was a fortress. And Ethan was its last guard alert, unyielding, waiting no longer. The dawn after the fire was no warmer than the night before. The sun hesitated behind the ridge, its light choked by heavy cloud, leaving Bridal Oak draped in a patchwork of grey. But Ethan had risen before the rooster's crow. He sat at the kitchen table, scraps of paper covered with clipped notes, routes, patrol times, exits, signals. A lifetime ago, he had drawn maps like these between command tents and dead forests. Now it was between the kitchen and the back lot. The target was different. The method the same. Build a trap. The old side shed was chosen as bait. Ethan cleared it bare, leaving most of the floor empty, but setting in the center a large wooden chest, dusted with false grime, edges stamped with fake seals carefully drawn in white ink and heat-dried. Inside lay no gold, no bonds, only bricks wrapped tight in bubble padding. What mattered wasn't inside, but around. The handle, hinges, rim, even the underside. Every place a thief might touch was laced with invisible UV powder, a substance revealed only under blacklight. No scent, no trace. But once touched, it would cling to hands, sleeves, shoes, even hair if a head leaned too close. Infrared cameras hid in the shed's corners, buried in old timber gone dark with age. Ethan wired them into a silent alarm system, the kind that made no sound at the scene, but sent its signal straight to the county dispatch. One trip, and every frame of data, every image, would be pushed out. No sirens, no flashing lights, no chance to escape. That night, a small logistics truck rolled slow through Bridal Oak's gate. Headlights snapped off the instant it cleared the old stone fence. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, hand on the radio, eyes unblinking. The driver was an outside hire background checked, signed to silence. They idled exactly 10 minutes. The tailgate cracked, rear lights blinking 3 times like a coded delivery signal. Staged so real, it felt true. The bait was set. At 11:12 p.m., the east camera caught motion. 2 figures appeared, dark clothes, caps pulled low, gloved hands. They moved without hurry. One drew bolt cutters, snapped the lock, tucked the tool away. The door creaked open. The sound caught faint by the mic hidden in the camera. Both slipped inside, straight for the chest. The taller one gripped the lid. In the dull red glow, he could not see the powder coating his palms, seeping into his knuckles, smearing the cuff of his jacket. The other lifted a forged, confidential deposit slip, held it to a penlight. When the chest lid lifted, the hinge circuit broke, the trip triggered. No siren, no flash. Just a pulse of data sent down the private line Ethan had laid 3 weeks back. 3 minutes later, a county sedan slid off Route 8. No lights, no siren. Tires ground gravel, unheard. At 3:16, another car braked under the willows. 6 officers in armor closed from 3 sides, 2 sweeping behind through the greenhouse, 2 holding the front, 2 locking the flank. When the nearer suspect turned to retreat, his arm was snapped, cuffed, before sound left his throat. The second froze under beams. Sweat pricked, eyes wide, his hands glowing faint, alive with powder, as the officers swept UV light across him. It shimmered eerie, like dust from another world. Both men were pressed into dirt, cuffed, faces down on the shed floor. No fight, no words. When Ethan entered, he didn't look at them. His eyes cut to the phone fallen near one suspect, the screen still lit. A message sent less than 15 seconds earlier. Done yet. No name. No picture. Just a line. Enough to show they weren't free actors. They had command above. IDs were pulled. One was a contract worker from a landscaping company, legal papers, registered firm, the same company Ethan had once hired for cleanup. Records showed one of the largest shareholders was the same man who had offered to buy Bridal Oak just 2 days after the will had been read. The line connected not openly, not in names spelled clear, but in the logic chain only men familiar with manipulation could read. When it was done, cruisers rolled out slow through the gate, tires marking wet grass. Ethan returned to the porch. Lights inside still burned. On the table sat a cup of tea gone cold. Esat, no si, no tremor. Everything had unfolded like the tactical sketch, no beat missed, no gap left. Only one piece was never in the diagram. Julia stood in the corner, phone in hand, eyes fixed not on him but on her reflection in the window pane. After a long silence she said, voice low, without defense, "There was a time I trusted the wrong person in the office. The secretary's gone, but the leak happened. That's on me." Ethan said nothing. He only looked at her. Long. Weighing all of it, the days in court, the flames at the gate, the smear of oil at the cellar door. He wasn't angry, but forgiveness would not come tonight. Forgiveness came last when the line was drawn, and the ground was clear again. Grant was no longer the shadow striker he had once been. The man who once preferred whispers, side deals, and half-hidden maneuvers had shed that skin. After his humiliating defeats in court, he did not retreat into silence, nor lick his wounds. He climbed higher, sharper, colder. This time, he did not file motions himself, did not bother with his own name on documents, did not show his face at conciliations where emotions might betray him. Instead, he purchased distance and power. He hired a powerhouse law firm out of Philadelphia, a name so weighty that clerks in the Ashford courthouse raised their brows and rechecked their files when they saw it. It was the kind of name that made people pause mid-sentence, a name that carried the smell of money and the echo of polished hallways lined with oil paintings. The firm did not arrive with bluster. They brought no shouted threats, no dramatic posturing. What they brought were binders stacked thick, stamped with seals, watermarked in fonts so old-fashioned and precise they seemed almost ritualistic. Each page was designed not only to persuade, but to intimidate, and buried deep among those hundreds of pages was the blade, an archaic clause, italicized in 18th century script, tucked like a snake in the margins of the third appendix of the original will. That clause declared that Bridal Oak Manor, more precisely, its original substructure, had once served as a white oak curative repository, a place where folk medicine practitioners stored healing oak, managed by the Price family's ancestors. The clause went further. It claimed that every fixed element, every artifact sealed within those walls, was non-transferable outside lineage, unless ratified by the Price Family Heirship Council. They called it kinship succession benefit. It was a technicality so arcane that it bordered on laughable. But in the hands of attorneys sharpened on money and prestige, it became a scalpel. No need to prove present ownership. It was enough to claim historical, special-use heritage. Enough to mount a reclamation. On its face, the argument sounded like academic jest, something students of law might debate in dusty seminar rooms. In the hands of a firm paid in full, it became a weapon. Julia received the official filing at 8:30 on a Monday morning. The subject line of the email was blunt, almost sterile. Supplemental motion, asset lineage claim. But when she opened the attachment and scanned the clauses, her chest tightened. She knew immediately this was Grant's final gambit, his last bid to turn the board upside down. And this time, she would not allow even a breath of error. She called an old contact, a heritage consultant who had once worked for the Pennsylvania State Museum, a man who had seen battles over colonial chapels, over gravestones crumbling in family plots, over estates older than the Republic itself. Together, they built a counter-record, brick by brick, building schematics, 20th century renovation permits, drone photography from the year prior, and most critically, the fixture inventory Ethan had filed when insuring the manor. Pennsylvania heritage law was clear on one point. Any historically affixed item, iron doors bolted into stone, underground vaults, wall-mounted maps, embedded safes, was inseparable from the property itself. Julia compiled more than 10 precedents, each scanned, each notarized, each lined up like a row of artillery. That afternoon, she spread them across the manor's kitchen table, not as paper, but as weapons. Ethan sat opposite her, motionless as stone, his hands resting on his thighs, his gaze following every line. He gave nothing away, but his attention never wavered. When the last page was turned, Ethan did not speak of changing lawyers. He did not voice doubts or thanks. He only said, steady and low, "From now on, every exchange must be documented and confirmed by email. No explanation. No rebuke." Julia understood instantly. She nodded. There was no offense. From that moment, the house itself seemed to tighten its discipline. Every draft carried dual signatures. Every meeting was recorded, witnessed by a neutral party. No personal calls, no stray texts, no whispered advice in hallways. Ethan managed the process like a commander securing a rear line. Protocol sheets were printed, taped to the filing cabinet, numbered, and locked by code. Even Hannah and Luke received a condensed 2-page version written in plain words. Who enters, who exits, who knows, who speaks. Outside, the legal war escalated. Inside, the manor grew quiet, almost too quiet, the silence of a pond before storm. That night Hannah noticed Luke was feverish. The boy, who rarely complained, lay curled up, forehead hot, eyes heavy. She sat by his side, pulled the blanket up, and whispered what her father had taught them. "What's the password? Do you remember?" Luke blinked, lips pressed tight, then whispered back, "Our home." It was more than a password. It was their anchor, a covenant. No matter who circled, no matter what papers were filed, this was theirs, still theirs. Ethan stepped into the room moments later. He asked nothing. He did not scold Hannah for staying awake. He simply pulled a chair beside the bed, placed his keyring against his chest, where his breath rose and fell, and left it there as the lamp dimmed. That night, no one truly slept. The wind whispered through the pines like old voices. The wall clock ticked away each minute, each one reminding them the war was not yet over. At precisely 3 in the morning, the auxiliary alarm gave a single ping, not a shriek, not flashing lights, just a faint vibration, like a needle striking steel. Ethan was on his feet instantly, flashlight in one hand, spare key at his hip. He moved down the stairs with silent precision. At the breaker panel, the red light glowed over auxiliary cellar. One tick. Silent. Door still shut. He swept the beam across the latch and froze. There, on the metal, was a film of oil, thin, clean, fresh, as though a hand had touched, but not turned. It wasn't his oil. He knew the brand he had used last. This was brighter, odorless, foreign. He did not open the door. Instead, he pressed a slip of white paper across the seam, signed his name in red ink, wrote the date, and marked the exact time of trigger. Then he stood, stared at the steel for several long seconds. His expression shifted. No longer defense, preparation. The look of a soldier setting his own fuse, not waiting for shells to fall, but ready to strike first. Tomorrow, the court would weigh everything. But tonight, Bridal Oak was no longer merely a house. It was a fortress. And Ethan Mallory stood at its gate, not just a father, not just a widower, but a sentry ready to hold the line. That morning, Pennsylvania wore its veil of silver haze, as if the entire land had decided against waking. The mist clung low, wrapped around the oaks and maples, turning every rooftop into a ghost. No birds broke the silence, no morning chatter. Only the faintest breeze slid through brittle oak leaves, carrying them across the roofs of the old houses with the whisper of parchment rubbed together. Ethan rose early, as he always did, and dressed with the same precision he had carried since his days in uniform. A dark blue shirt pressed sharp at every seam, cuffs buttoned tight, leather belt drawn without a crease. His shave was so close it left his jaw raw, a soldier's ritual carried into civilian life. To anyone watching, the details looked minor. To him, they were a wall against collapse, small, immovable acts of discipline. Hannah and Luke were gone from the house, sent away the night before with Julia to trusted friends in a neighboring town. Ethan had refused to let them see this day. He would not have their young faces in the gallery, would not risk the judgment of strangers thinking he used his children to curry sympathy, in number. He wanted no sentiment, no easy pity. What lay ahead wasn't theater, it was a border stand. Something he had known in Iraq and Tikrit, the nights when his unit had to hold the crossroads of a village. Lose the crossroad, and you lost everything: men, rifles, roofs, the fragile thread of hope. This morning was no different. Only the sandbags had been replaced by legal briefs, obscure clauses, and a gavel wielded by a man in a black robe. When Ethan pulled his truck into the gravel lot of the Westmore courthouse and swung the door open, he felt none of the nervous energy of a civilian heading into trial. His chest and mind locked into another frame. This was a defensive position, not a hearing. His boots on the ground weren't pacing for nerves but bracing for siege. He moved with quiet certainty, the certainty of someone who understood what it meant to stand in the open while others fired unseen rounds. Courtroom 3 was already packed when he entered. The benches were filled tight, half townsfolk curious for drama, half clerks and aides assigned to the day's docket. The air was heavy with the blend of old wood varnish and the faint tang of copier ink. The Price family's side was an armory unto itself. 2 lead attorneys polished like blades, a clerk scribbling with mechanical precision, and a tower of files stacked high enough to rest an elbow upon. Their suits were pale grey, their shoes shined so bright they caught every beam of light like mirrors. When their eyes passed Ethan, they did not pause, did not meet him. He was treated as if he were furniture, something unavoidable but unworthy of recognition. Julia entered moments later, not with flourish but with momentum. She carried weight blueprints rolled under one arm, satellite imagery tucked against her chest, thick binders of insurance filings balanced on the other side. With her came the preservation consultant and estate advisor, faces set in stone. They were not a show of numbers, they were a show of readiness. Ethan took his place in the second row, hands folded, head bent slightly, eyes fixed on a single sealed envelope, resting before him. He did not fidget, did not glance to the sides. He sat as a man sits in ambush, every muscle taut, waiting for the signal. The judge, hair salted with grey, wire frames perched low on his nose, began with the reading of the Price petition. The words rolled like artillery fire, measured, repeated, intended to wear down resolve. Once again, the claim was simple. Ethan was no price by blood, no man of income, unfit to hold or preserve the estate. But today they pressed harder, pivoting to a sharper wedge: exploitation of asset for personal gain. Their attorneys alleged that Ethan might be hiding valuables, might be moving them out from under the nose of the court. Items they said lay beyond his lawful custody. Their lawyer's voice was crisp, each phrase launched like a pin striking a map, designed to pierce not only the judge, but the room's perception of the man sitting in the second row. Julia did not blink. When her turn came, she did not spread the table with all her binders. She chose one folder. She placed it before the judge like a card meant to anchor the hand. "Your Honor," she said evenly, her voice carrying the weight of ground prepared. "The property is designated under insurance contract as a non-divisible asset class. Every item from the wall maps to the iron chest in the cellar is a fixed property under state law." She produced images taken from the security cameras at each sealed point, the UV-coded locks glowing under light that only the insurer could validate. She then offered the custody report, signed by Ethan and the preservation specialist, listing every object catalogued, photographed, GPS tagged, co-signed by a state officer. The trail was unbroken, meticulous. The Price attorneys countered, sharp as knives, seals could be forged. Julia did not rise to their tone. She only tilted her head slightly, voice cool as stone. "We have UV-coded photographs. These codes cannot be replicated without original manufacturer hardware. Here is the independent laboratory report." The judge studied each photo, each page, for long minutes. The room seemed to hold its breath. The only sound was the soft, mechanical hum of the ceiling vent. Finally, he closed the folder. He tapped his knuckles once against the wooden bench. "The motion to transfer guardianship or revoke bridal oak control is denied. The cited clauses in the appendix lack sufficient strength against the documented chain. The temporary protective order is extended." The room exhaled all at once, a ripple of air-like pressure breaking, but there was no applause, no murmur of triumph. Ethan did not move, did not smile, did not even shift his hands. He simply looked ahead, eyes unmoved. Julia glanced his way. He returned the glance with a single nod. Not the nod of victory, the nod of a soldier who had held a line for now, for one more day. At recess, deputies escorted the Price team out through a side door, away from the public gallery. Julia remained inside, head bent with her advisors, already preparing the extension filings. Ethan walked alone, stepping out into the cold light, circling toward the back lot. Gravel crunched under his boots. That was when it came. A sound, small but distinct. The metallic clap of a mesh door striking its frame in the service wing, a noise so faint no civilian would have paused. Ethan froze. And in his right ear, the subtle vibration, the silent alarm from Bridal Oak. Sub-cellar. Triggered. He did not race for his truck, did not gun the engine. Panic had no place in protocol. He followed drill, as he had taught his children. His thumb pressed the sequence on the remote fob lockdown initiated. At home, exterior lights cut out. Secondary bolts slid into place. Silent defense mode. He dialed the sheriff's secure channel, the line they had agreed upon weeks ago. On the screen of his phone, linked to the south roof infrared cam, the shapes appeared. Two intruders vaulting the fence. Their movements were efficient, practiced. One, cap pulled low, went directly for the hatch. He used a card spoof, a wrench twist. The lock clicked. But the instant his palm closed over the handle, the trap spoke. His skin lit under the invisible UV dust Julia had layered days earlier. To the naked eye, it was nothing. To the infrared lens, it was a brand. The glow clung, chemical and unshakable, and it would bind to flesh for 48 hours. Ethan did not storm from the courthouse like some action hero. He did not chase. He stood under the porch overhang, eyes locked to the live feed. He waited as the two figures entered the corridor between the hatch and the main path. The choke point he had designed, narrow as a funnel. When both bodies were inside the box, he pressed his trigger. Steel bolts slammed down from hidden grooves. The exit sealed with a finality that echoed even through the feed. 3 minutes later, cruisers slid into place at Bridal Oak. No sirens, no lights, just the muted sweep of tires over gravel. Deputies moved in, professional, silent. The sheriff himself stepped forward, the cuffs in his hand closing with a click that carried no drama, only inevitability. That afternoon, as sunlight angled low through the old oaks and the haze began to burn off, the sheriff returned to Ethan at the courthouse. He held a slim object, sealed in nylon. "We found this in the lead man's car," he said. It was the leather cover of a ledger, old and worn, edges softened by years of handling. On the bottom corner, etched faintly, was a medallion symbol. Ethan knew it instantly. It was the same mark Maya had once carved into the frame of their wedding photograph. But that wasn't what held him still. Inside, on the first page, a single line of ink sprawled across the yellowed paper. Coordinates. Not for Bridal Oak. A different place. Beyond the boundary lines of the estate. Somewhere untouched, unsearched, waiting in silence. Ethan closed the nylon back between the sheriff's fingers, his expression giving away nothing. No noise, no blood spilled. Just another secret, surfacing like a stone rising slow from the depths. A signal that the war wasn't finished, only shifted. That morning the sun rose over Hollow Creek, with a gentleness not seen for many months, as if the valley had finally set aside its mourning and permitted itself to breathe. Light spilled over the ridgeline, pale gold sweeping across the meadow, and found its way down to the newly painted fence that guarded Bridal Oak Manor. The fence cast clean, unwavering shadows on damp gravel, straight lines where once there had only been collapse. The house no longer looked like a ruin. It stood as something reborn. The grass had been trimmed smooth, the gate sanded and painted to match the porch wood, the stone paths relayed so not a single crack interrupted the walk. Roof tiles glistened slate grey under morning sun, not sagging but firm, as if the old house had finally accepted its duty to stand. By the mailbox, freshly painted white, hung a small sign, Bridal Oak, Living History. Not a museum plaque to keep people out, not a monument meant only for reverence. A declaration. This house was alive again. Ethan spoke little. He stood tall in his old army coat, sleeves rolled, collar pressed, before a modest gathering of 30 or so townsfolk, a handful of county officials, even a small camera crew that had come to capture the moment. His hands were steady at his sides, his jawline shadowed by discipline. He carried no long speech written on paper, only the weight of months of struggle that pressed heavy in his chest. When his time came, his voice was even, unadorned. Like a man reporting truth more than giving testimony. This house was once a joke, he said. Now, it's a promise. No more words followed. He didn't need them. His plainness was the proof. The ribbon cutting was quiet, understated. No marching band, no applause. Just the clean snip of scissors and the porch boards groaning as weight crossed them again. Hannah and Luke stepped first across the threshold. Their small hands were clasped tightly together, their steps measured and reverent, as though they knew instinctively the house deserved more than excitement, it deserved respect. Julia followed, binder in hand, hair tied back neat. On the binder's cover the words were stamped, Bridal Oak Family Trust, Initial Allocation. Her voice was firm and precise as she spoke briefly of discipline, legacy, and transparency. She reminded the crowd this story was never about hoarded treasure, but about law, verification, distribution, about taking what had been hidden and putting it to use for a community. 2 initiatives were seeded that day, a reading library for the town school and scholarships for teenagers who would learn trades, electricians, carpenters, welders, mechanics, not towers of ivory learning, but skills that could hold a roof steady, keep lights on, build a future. Julia added one note, that Maya Mallory had once written in her journal she wanted to teach welding. Now, her name would appear on every scholarship certificate, a quiet message from a mother long gone but still present. Papers moved across the table, hands steady, signatures drawn in ink. County officials pressed their stamps down with a hollow thunk that echoed through the room louder than any applause. With that sound, legality became permanence. By noon, the crowd thinned. People walked away down the gravel lane, their conversations fading into ordinary town life. In the backyard, Hannah and Luke lingered. They worked side by side in soil freshly turned, pressing small wooden stakes into the earth. One read, carrots. Another read, Dad's basil. A third, painted in bright orange letters of a child's hand, read, Hannah's marigolds. The earth swallowed them with welcome. Ethan watched from the porch. In his hand was a charcoal rubbing of the triangle symbol, once etched into the attic beam. He did not frame it or hide it away. He pinned it to the doorway between 2 old nails, not as a display piece, as memory. A reminder that walls could hold secrets, and secrets could become maps. It could have ended there, but evening came, and with it a quiet unsettledness. After the final cars left Hollow Creek, after house lights flickered to life and then dimmed behind the windows, Ethan stepped onto the porch and saw it, a plain envelope taped to the mailbox. Sheriff's insignia marked the front. He peeled it free, the wind tugging at the corner, and opened it beneath the yellow porch lamp. Inside lay a photograph of the leather ledger seized from the intruder's car a week earlier. On its cover, faintly pressed, was the triangle symbol, the same etched on Maya's pendant, but there was more. Beneath the symbol ran penciled coordinates. One line circled, Bridal Oak Manor, but below, a second line, not circled. And at the very bottom, in a slanting script, almost too fine to see, if I never told you, go to Hollow Creek, mile 7, Twin Oaks. Ethan's breath did not quicken, his face did not move. But his hand tightened around the key. He still carried Maya's key, once strung on the chain with the triangle pendant. The night wind slipped across the porch, rustling the envelope's edge. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. He said nothing, but he stood with the stillness of a soldier who hears a distant signal, Not sound, not frequency, but instinct. If anyone had been there to film it, the frame would have faded to black. But the story did not end at fade. Because legacies never end with ribbon cuttings. They live in coordinates written in a hidden hand, in a wife's unspoken message, in a last walk down a dirt road to mile 7, where two oaks stand silent, guarding what waits below. Ethan had said once, "This house is a promise." Perhaps that had been true. Perhaps it was also a map, and he had not yet turned the final page. Ethan Mallory's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest wealth is not measured in gold or bonds, but in how memory is held, how promises are kept, how family is protected even after loss. The old soldier never sought loud triumphs. His victories were quiet. Transparency, discipline, loyalty to those who remained. At any age, a man can begin again, if he has the courage to keep heart. A house may collapse, a roof may fall, but trust, if tended carefully, always finds ground to rise anew. Often it is what remains after the fire and the loss that points the way home. When Ethan hung that wooden sign on the gate reading, "Bridal Oak, Living History," it was not for vanity. He sought no victory. He wanted the place once cold and disputed to now be a yard where children's bare feet ran across summer grass, where carrots and basil sprouted in rows, where marigolds blazed against the soil, where small dreams grew without fear. It was not an ending, nor even a beginning. It was that rare pause in a soldier's life when the spade could be set down, when breath could be drawn without vigilance, when he could know he had kept his word to his wife, to his children, to the house itself. He had kept Bridal Oak standing. He had kept the memory intact, and above all, he had kept peace within his reach. And if this story touches you, if it recalls an old house you once knew, an unspoken promise, or someone you remember who stood steady through a storm to guard what was right, then share it. Leave a word. Leave it plain. Leave it honest. Because stories like this don't end with a period. They end when another voice picks them up and carries them forward.